Hi, everyone. I am Rick Zanotti, and this is eLearnChat. I'm joined today by my good friend and co-host, Dr. Susan Nash. How are you doing, Susan?
I'm fine. It's been a little bit chilly, but it's a beautiful spring day and everything is wonderful.
We have a little bit of rain up here in the Boise Meridian area. Just a little bit. Now it's getting sunny. Weird weather. 73 yesterday. That was beautiful.
Wow.
I'm
Wow.
getting a bit of a tan. Anyway, here we go. This show is sponsored by Talking Vids, corporate video, e-learning, enterprise-wide development, online interviews, multimedia development, and more. Visit us at www.talkingvids.com. And we are back, and today we're going to talk about something that everybody complains about. They say people just don't think critically anymore. It's a problem coming out of schools, coming out of business, coming in pretty much everywhere. But what is critical thinking, and why don't people think critically? I have one theory, but Susan, what do you think? What do you think is going on with the critical thinking
Well,
finger
the first
pointing?
thing that comes to mind when I think about lack of critical thinking is
This show
like
is
taking
sponsored by Talking Vids. That's weird. Okay, controller malfunction. Okay, sorry about that.
it's funny.
Critical
Well,
controller here.
the first thing that comes to mind is the idea of cognitive bias. And so there are many different types of cognitive bias, but basically they create cognitive blindness. They make you see something and think reality is something because it feels good. The confirmation bias is the first one that comes to mind.
That's interesting. Critical thinking. Well, I'll give you one of my theories. One reason why critical thinking isn't so good anymore.
Hmm.
Nobody writes, at least not
Oh,
on a
right.
normal, regular basis. Writing forces your brain to organize, to look at things, to plan ahead a little bit, to leave out some of the emotion. Maybe you can be more logical, there's more reason involved. So when you're looking at the idea of critical thinking, I don't think you can be critical if you're emotional, if you're being too emotional, because you're missing way too many things that you could be organizing for, and you probably won't be as organized. What do you think of that?
Well, that's a really good point because, for example, it depends on what kind of writing, but let's say that you're
Hmm.
doing argumentation. Well, then you have to think about A, your audience, and think about their beliefs. But then if you're thinking about the argument itself, you have to look at evidence and you have to break it down. So you have to identify what your uh, what your argument is. For example, what are the things that influence the price of gold, for example? One could say, jump to some conclusion or repeat something, but if you have to list it out, at least you're thinking, and you're thinking of like four factors. So I really agree with you.
Yeah, and with critical thinking, you need that ability to also observe yourself,
Hmm.
because as you're trying to plan something ahead, if you get let's rule out emotion as part of critical thinking, because if you get too emotional, critical thinking goes out the door. You'll make bad decisions. You'll react not necessarily well. So to be a good critical thinker, you've got to look at yourself. You've got to look at where you're planning to go or what you're planning to do with whatever you're doing, and then organize the steps to make that happen. And I don't know. We've dealt with a lot of both juniors, interns, and others throughout the years coming right out of college, and there wasn't a lot of critical thinking in many of their cases. There are exceptions, but most react emotionally to things. And mind you, we're in the media world, so we get a little bit more of the creative, emotional type, which isn't necessarily the best critical thinker. However, they're very creative. So how do you make someone, for example, very, very creative, a little less emotional and a little more logical? It's a tough one. It's a tough one. And depending on the classes they take or depending on what they're good at or what they like, I find it hard to make some people look at something without the emotion. And yet without emotion, nobody remembers anything. So you're stuck in that, catch-22 of, well, do we make something very emotional, very ridden with emotion or pain or thoughts or something? Or do you get cold and more logical, more reasoning? How would you go about teaching someone, and actually you are a college or a university professor and you've taught classes and all sorts of different things. How do you get people to think more critically?
Well, what you said about coming in at it from an independent third party perspective and looking at it at yourself and learning how to do that is really, really important. And I don't know if you ever read Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on cognitive bias and also thinking fast and thinking slow.
Mm-hmm. I haven't.
Part of the issue of critical thinking is that there's a part of us, like you were saying, if you're thinking emotionally, you're thinking fast.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually a survival aspect. And you're responding often with your limbic system engaged. And so you're thinking survival and you're making quick decisions that seem to be in your best interest.
Fight or flight.
However, fight or flight, exactly. But then if you go and you think slowly and analyze each one, that almost takes a group effort. It's often important to bring in another person, an independent third party, because if you are working within your organization, you reinforce poor thinking through groupthink, and you don't even realize it's groupthink.
Right. Well, there's also that pressure when you're in a group to want to do what makes the group happy. If you've been in a lot of group sessions, and I remember in a lot of project kickoffs and stuff, you try to have a session where you just come up with ideas, and you can always tell most people don't want to come up with too many ideas because it may bother someone. It may be going against the boss who's in that meeting or somebody else. And so you have groupthink that's not really thinking too much. There's usually one or two people thinking, the rest just kind of go, kind of the lemming, approach to management, or to developing something because that's how they're seeing things. And the problem with that is, again, they're not thinking critically. They're reacting emotionally and thinking it might be critical thought. That's a tough one. It's a tough one because how do you get people to relax enough so that they can think clearly and look ahead? For example, like you said, if one person can't do it on their own, you bring somebody in to help, which is good because that person can observe the other person either not thinking clearly or not thinking critically or not seeing what the options are. For example, if somebody says you've got to create, let's say you create a class, and in the class you want to have certain subjects taught and you have to reach a certain level. Okay, you know what the subjects are. Let's assume it's history and sociology. How do you teach history and sociology critically obviously history is something that's already been done. It's been acted out. There's no emotion left unless you went through that history. It is the story of what's left, of what happened, or who wrote what happened, whether it happened or not. It's the old problem of history's written by the winners, not the losers. But how do you critically look at that? You have to leave some of that emotion out, unless you're trying to get emotion in for whatever reason, maybe to make the story or the history more effective.
Well, you're bringing up a really interesting thing, and it has a lot to do with power and power dynamics. So, two areas. One, you have the power of, for example, if you're in a group and you have a powerful, charismatic leader, well, it's very risky to cross that charismatic leader. So, you have a voice only as long as that charismatic leader allows you to. The enlightened charismatic leader will do distributed leadership and let people have power based on different projects and their expertise. But then the other bigger persistent issue is what Luhmann and Bergman talked about this is 1960s concept, but it became really powerful. And it's the social construction of reality. And it's how those hegemonic or power structures enforce a certain worldview. So to the point where you to be able to see in a different perspective, you have to step out of that worldview. And to my mind, what we're seeing now in our society is a clash between two competing worldviews, and they can't see beyond their own worldview.
That's a good point. For example, if you look at, let's say, communist ideology, you can't be too creative. Let's face it, people die in a lot of communist dictatorships or whatever else. You can't come up with certain kinds of ideas, and you can't be overly critical or organized because it may go against the quote-unquote foundational principles. Now you have some of the same problems, whether it's a capitalistic system or something else, that all systems, depending on who the leaders are, can be manipulated, they can be coerced, they can be changed, they can be modified to act a certain way or react a certain way based on who's running what. And it doesn't have to be a who, it could be a group of who's. Whether it's a Politburo or whether it's just one individual or a group of individuals, the same problem arises. Power doesn't like to be bucked too often. Power likes to control. How do you react critically? Actually, it's pretty simple in a critical situation when power is controlling. If you look ahead, you go, if I buck the power, I may be dead or in prison or something. Maybe that's not a good idea. Critical thinking, simple. You're not going too deep into it, and you're not going to get lost in the weeds because you won't be around too long to enjoy that one. But the whole idea of critical thinking is to think in a reasonable and logical manner, at least as far as design and everything else goes. Does emotion play a role in critical thinking? What do you think?
Well, obviously it does. And I think that when something feels comfortable and you don't feel challenged, sometimes that's reinforcing your preconceived notions and you're not going out of your paradigmatic way of thinking. And it's interesting in Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He's the one who came up with the concept of paradigms, the paradigm shift. And the Copernican revolution, before the idea of reality was shaped, the structure of the earth and the universe was understood by means of medieval cosmology, which was the church.
Right.
And so people were literally killed for not saying that the earth was the center of the galaxy. It was supposed to be the sun was. And so then what had to happen in reality was that power had to shift so that it was possible to be able to have permission to see from different perspectives. So that can either happen through an enlightened leader, or it can be happen through commercial interests, where there's so much money coming in from trade and trying out new inventions, et cetera, that it become that the power structures that are become destabilized.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting from just something to take away from what we're talking about. To think critically, you have to organize your thoughts. If emotions or fears or other things come into those thoughts, then you may not be looking at it in a logical or reasonable manner. You may be looking at it emotionally, fearfully, and that will definitely affect what you're thinking about, and probably not in a very positive way. So how do we, as people, when you're trying to get a point across, how do you present points or present thoughts and leave out emotion, especially at the early stages? I mean, emotion will probably come out of anything because it's just part of our being. But how do we control that level of emotion so that when we are presenting something, we're not presenting it emotionally, which will affect a group and not for the better usually. Mob
Well,
mentality, mob mentality is one of those.
okay. So the Dalai Lama wrote things about how destructive emotions create your own reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so the approach that he took was to say, meditate and change your line of thinking and get clarity and walk away from any of the thoughts that are generating any emotions and go to a place of neutrality.
That makes a good point because that's where writing comes in. When you're
Yes, I love
meditating,
that.
you're focusing on something. When you're writing,
Mhm.
it slows you down, just like meditation. You have to think about it a little bit more, whether you're typing or writing by hand, a lost art nowadays. But the more you write, the slower your emotional centers react. So it's a good point. Whether you meditate or do something else, go practice Tai Chi Chuan or something, but do something that gets you out of the frantic mode, especially if you're
Yes.
reacting. And like you said, if you react very quickly and you're not trained to react quickly, you react maybe emotionally or fearfully, that's not a winning proposition usually. Imagine if you're in a situation where an accident happens or you're in war. If you're reacting emotionally, there's a good chance you may get hurt. Or in an accident, you may not know how to react or how to avoid an accident if the emotions kick in, if that fear kicks in. If you can control the fear, if you can control your emotions, how you move, how you think, that can be trained. Now, you can train people to do that. Like you said, whether it's meditation or something else, you can train people to do that. And the chances of having quality critical thought, I think, will improve 100 or 1,000%. Whereas if
Oh,
they
that's
don't
so
have,
true.
yeah, if they don't have any training in that, not necessarily.
Well, so true. And one of the techniques that's used is called reframing.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, it's very easy to say, oh my gosh, there's so much change. It looks like negative change. Oh, I've got to control this. I've got to get out in front of it. And then, and then it's reactive. However, if you reframe that and instead of looking at change as potentially destructive or threatening to you, but change as opportunity, you can reframe the way that you look at the phenomena around us and make it positive.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Well, anyway, now that we have completely convinced people to think critically, Think about it.
Run.
If you haven't been taught to run, if you haven't been taught to think critically, if you know that you react emotionally, take the time to try to learn how to think more critically, how to organize your mind, your thoughts, your ability to execute on something that's not emotional or could be emotional, how to retain control. I mean, if you look at first responders, they may be very affected emotionally, but they control it. They have to, or they'd
You
be
need a two-shot.
completely, they'd be ineffective.
I'm jumping in. You need a two-shot.
Are we in a two-shot?
No, we're in a one-shot. It's
Oh,
just
that's
on me.
funny. Sorry,
There
finger.
we go.
Finger didn't quick click as hard as it should. Anyway, yeah. So all of that will make a huge difference to how people react, think, and there's a chance you will succeed in anything you do a whole lot better if you can think critically, if you can write, if you can control the emotions, if you can plan ahead and stick to those plans. Then there's a good chance that those things that you're afraid of won't be your enemies. They won't really be your foes at all. You can control them and control the situations. That doesn't mean you're an automaton who's going to be totally hard and cold. No, it just means you control your emotions when needed, which is important. You can't always go completely hysterical. That's not a good thing. It's not going to guarantee any promotions or anything else. Any final thoughts, Susan?
I've just really enjoyed this discussion, and these are things that I am eager to put into practice every day, and even more, especially the part about writing and keeping a journal and holding.
And you're a writer. You write a lot, so you naturally do that.
I love to. I think it's important. A lot of times afterwards I look at my notes. I think, well, that's just kind of a bunch of scribbles. But in shaping those scribbles, I can at least go back and mull things over.
Right. Give us your comments below if you have any techniques or would like to hear more about this, and we can touch upon it in a later show. But critical thinking for training is really important. So if you're thinking it isn't, think again. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.